Billionaire's quintuplets were dying, until the new maid did the unthinkable act. The silence in the Thorne estate was not peaceful, it was predatory. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of antiseptic and lemon polish, stifling the air across 20,000 square feet of marble and mahogany. Julian Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the West Wing nursery, his reflection ghostly against the glass. Outside, the world was vibrant, green, and alive. Inside, it was a sterile purgatory. At 32, Julian was the titan of the tech industry, a man who could move markets with a whisper. Yet here, in this temperature-controlled room, he was utterly powerless. Behind him, 5 hospital-grade beds were arranged in a semicircle. Machines hummed rhythmically, monitoring the faint heartbeats of his daughters, Lily, Rose, Daisy, Violet, and Iris, 5 years old. They should have been tearing the wallpaper down, screaming, laughing, making messes. Instead, they were silent, pale little dolls with shaved heads, their eyes too big for their gaunt faces. Failure to thrive, the specialists called it. A catch-all term for dying of a broken heart. Since their mother passed during childbirth and the subsequent aggressive treatments for their immune disorders, they had simply stopped. They refused to eat. They refused to play. They were fading out of existence. "Mr. Thorne?" Julian turned. The new housekeeper stood in the doorway. Clara Mercer. She was different from the agency staff he usually hired. She didn't shrink away from his glare. She was a tall, stunning black woman with eyes that held a depth of sorrow he recognized, but also a spark he couldn't place. She wasn't wearing the standard gray scrubs of the medical staff, but a crisp navy uniform that she wore with the dignity of a queen. "What is it, Clara?" "The nurses are on break. Do not disturb the girls." Clara stepped fully into the room, her gaze not on the billionaire, but on the 5 sets of eyes watching her from the beds. "They aren't sleeping, sir. And they aren't disturbing anyone. That's the problem, isn't it?" Julian bristled. "I pay you to clean, Ms. Mercer, not to diagnose." "I cleaned the kitchen," she said softly, her voice like warm honey. "I found the organic nutrient paste the chefs prepare. It tastes like wet cardboard. No wonder they're starving. It's medically prescribed." "It's misery on a spoon," Clara countered, her voice firm but kind. She walked over to Iris, the smallest of the 5, and gently touched the girl's cheek. Iris didn't flinch. She leaned into the warmth of the hand. "You're keeping them alive, Mr. Thorne. But you aren't giving them a life." Julian opened his mouth to fire her, but the words died in his throat. Iris had just wrapped her tiny, frail fingers around Clara's thumb. It was the first voluntary movement the child had made in weeks. 2 days later, the impossible happened. Julian had been called away to an emergency board meeting in the city. The grim governess, Mrs. Higgins, was asleep in the staff quarters. The security team was changing shifts. Clara moved with the precision of a tactical operative, but her mission was joy. She entered the nursery carrying not mops or buckets, but 5 distinct piles of fabric. "All right, little ladies," Clara whispered, a conspiratorial grin lighting up her face. "No more pajamas. Today we are going on an adventure." The girls looked at her, confused. Daisy sat up. "Daddy says, outside is germs." "Daddy loves you," Clara said, pulling a light blue, sleeveless dress over Daisy's head. "But Daddy forgot that sunshine is also medicine. We're going to be careful, but we are going to be brave." She dressed them all, matching blue dresses that made their eyes pop. She didn't try to hide their bald heads with itchy wigs. She simply kissed each forehead. She ushered them down the servants' staircase, bypassing the main security grid, and piled them into her battered, reliable station wagon parked around the back. They drove for 20 minutes, leaving the gated community of silence behind, entering the vibrant, noisy, messy world of the living. They arrived at Ruby's Diner. It was a relic of the 1950s, a place of chrome, neon, and grease. The moment they walked in, the diner went quiet. People stared. 5 pale, bald children in matching dresses looking like little porcelain ghosts, led by a woman who walked like she owned the place. But Clara didn't apologize. She guided them to the best seat in the house, a round yellow-edged table near the jukebox. "Sit," she commanded gently. The girls sat, their eyes wide, absorbing the sensory overload. The smell of frying bacon, the sound of Elvis on the radio, the red vinyl booths. "What is this place?" Rose whispered. "This," Clara said, tying a classic white apron over her dress and putting on a lace headpiece she'd pulled from her bag, transforming into the waitress she once was years ago, "is where magic happens." She went behind the counter. The owner, an old friend named Earl, nodded at her and started the grill. But Clara wasn't there for burgers. She went to the ice cream station. She worked with the focus of an artist. 5 scoops. Vanilla, strawberry, chocolate, mint, pistachio, hot fudge. Whipped cream piled high like a cumulus cloud. Sprinkles that shimmered like gemstones. Cherries. And finally, the pièce de résistance, a sparkler candle. She carried the giant glass dish to the table. The sparkler hissed and popped, casting a golden glow over the girls' faces. For the first time in their lives, the Thorne quintuplets weren't patients. They were children. "It's fire!" Violet gasped, terrified. "It's a light," Clara corrected, placing the spoon in Violet's hand. "Make a wish." Violet looked at the ice cream, then at her sisters, then at Clara. A slow, tentative smile broke across her face. It was radiant. She took a scoop. Then Lily did. Then all of them. They weren't just eating. They were devouring the sweetness they had been denied. The bell above the diner door jingled violently. The air in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Standing in the doorway was Julian Thorne. He was flanked by 2 large security guards. He was panting, his tie askew, his face a mask of sheer terror and fury. He had tracked Clara's phone. "Get away from them!" Julian roared, his voice cracking. The entire diner froze. The music seemed to stop. Julian stormed toward the table, his eyes scanning his daughters for injuries, for allergic reactions, for death. "You lost your mind. You kidnapped my children. You brought them to a grease trap?" He reached out to grab Iris, to pull her away from the poison she was eating. "Daddy!" Iris squealed. Julian froze. His hand hovered in the air. Iris wasn't crying. She wasn't shrinking away. She was holding up a spoon dripping with melted strawberry ice cream. Her face was smeared with chocolate, and she was beaming. "Daddy, look!" Iris cheered, pointing at the dying sparkler. "It's magic!" Julian stood there, a billionaire in a $3,000 suit, paralyzed in the middle of a cheap diner. He looked at Clara. She stood behind the girls, her hands resting protectively on their shoulders. She didn't look guilty. She looked defiant. "They're eating, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice cutting through the silence. "For the first time in 6 months, they are eating." Julian looked at the empty bowl. He looked at his daughter's flushed cheeks. The fury in his chest collided with a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief, leaving him breathless. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Just the sound of his daughter's giggling as the sparkler finally fizzled out. The investigation and the bond. The ride back to the mansion was silent, but the atmosphere had shifted tectonically. The girls fell asleep instantly in the back of the limousine, sugar-crashed and exhausted from the stimulation. Julian sat opposite them, watching their chests rise and fall. He kept glancing at Clara, who sat quietly by the window, watching the trees blur by. When they arrived, the medical team was waiting, swarming the car like white ants. They checked vitals, temperatures, and blood sugar levels. "Remarkable," Dr. Aris muttered, checking Rose's pulse. "Her heart rate is stronger than it's been in months." Whatever happened, it didn't hurt them. Julian stood in the grand foyer, watching Clara hang up her coat. He should fire her. He should have her arrested for kidnapping. Every instinct of self-preservation told him she was a loose cannon. "Ms. Mercer," Julian said, his voice low. Clara turned. She looked tired now, the adrenaline fading. "I'll pack my things, sir." I'll be out of your hair in an hour." "Why did you do it?" Julian asked, genuinely baffled. "You risked everything. Your job, your freedom." Clara looked him dead in the eye. "Because I once had a daughter, Mr. Thorne. She spent her whole life in a hospital bed. She died sterile and safe. I promised myself I'd never let another child forget what the sun feels like." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Julian felt a crack in his armor. He saw the pain behind her warm smile. "You're on probation," Julian said abruptly. "Strict probation. You do not leave the grounds. You do not change their diet without consulting me. But you stay." Clara nodded slowly. "Understood." Over the next 2 weeks, the Thorne mansion changed. It was a subtle invasion. Julian began spending less time at the office, working instead from his study. He had the security feed of the nursery and the playroom pulled up on his third monitor. It became his obsession. He watched Clara work. It was indeed magic. He saw how she turned their physical therapy exercises into dance parties. She put on old jazz records, Etta James, Louis Armstrong, and taught the girls to sway. Julian found himself tapping his pen to the rhythm, mesmerizing by the way Clara moved, so full of life in this house of death. He watched her combat their nausea not with pills, but with peppermint tea and stories. She told them tales of warrior princesses who lost their hair in battle to grow stronger helmets of gold later. He saw Violet looking in the mirror, rubbing her bald head, not with shame, but with pride. One rainy Tuesday, the intrusion of the outside world shattered the peace. Victoria van der Hoven, Julian's fiancée, arrived for lunch. Victoria was sculpted perfection, blonde, icy, and sharp. She regarded the quintuplets as unfortunate accessories to her future life as Mrs. Thorne. They sat in the formal dining room. The girls were seated at the far end, eating a hearty stew Clara had prepared. "Julian, darling," Victoria said, sipping her wine, "we really need to discuss the wedding date and arrangements for the girls. Boarding school in Switzerland has an excellent medical facility. It would be less stressful for you." Julian gripped his fork. "They are 5, Victoria. They are recovering. They are sickly, Julian. And that woman," Victoria gestured vaguely with her glass toward Clara, who was wiping Daisy's mouth. "She's turning them into savages. Look at them. They're loud. They're happy," Julian said, surprising himself. Suddenly, Rose knocked over her glass of water. It shattered on the marble floor. Victoria gasped, jumping up. "You clumsy little brat! Look at my shoes!" Rose shrank back, tears welling up. The old fear returned instantly. Before Julian could stand, Clara was there. She didn't clean the water. She knelt between Rose and Victoria. "It's just water, Miss van der Hoven," Clara said, her voice low but laced with steel. "Water dries. Tears are harder to fix. Please lower your voice." Victoria's face went crimson. "You are the help. Do not speak to me." "I am their caregiver," Clara corrected, "and in this room, their feelings matter more than your shoes." The room went silent. Julian watched the 2 women. Victoria, beautiful but hollow. Clara, simple but radiating a fierce protective power. "Victoria," Julian said calmly. "Sit down. Clara is right." Victoria sat, stunned, her mouth agape. Julian looked at Clara and gave a nearly imperceptible nod of gratitude. For the first time, he saw Clara not as an employee, but as a partner. That evening, Julian found himself wandering to the library. He heard soft singing. Clara was sitting on the rug by the fireplace, the 5 girls piled on top of her like puppies. She was humming a lullaby, stroking Iris's head. The firelight danced on her skin, making her look ethereal. Julian leaned against the doorframe, watching. He felt a pang of longing so intense it terrified him. He missed this. He missed the warmth of a family. Clara looked up and saw him. She didn't stop humming, but she smiled, a genuine, soft smile that was just for him. He walked into the room. "Is there room for one more?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The girls gasped. Daddy never sat on the floor. Daddy never ruined his suit pants. "Always," Clara whispered. Julian sat on the edge of the rug. Daisy crawled over and sat on his lap. He wrapped his arms around her frail body, feeling her heartbeat. He looked at Clara over his daughter's head. Their eyes locked. In that moment, the distance between the billionaire and the maid evaporated. There was only the fire, the sleeping children, and a dangerous, beautiful magnetic pull that neither of them could deny. Julian reached out to adjust the blanket on Rose, and his hand brushed Clara's. A spark, hotter than the fire, shot through him. He didn't pull away. And neither did she. "You're saving them," Julian whispered. "We are saving them," Clara corrected softly. But in the shadows of the hallway, Victoria stood watching, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the doorframe until the wood splintered. She saw the look on Julian's face. She saw the domestic tableau, and she realized that the maid wasn't just a nuisance. She was a threat, and threats had to be eliminated. The sabotage and separation. The atmosphere in the Thorne mansion shifted in the days following the library incident. It was no longer a cold vacuum. It was a battlefield draped in silk and polite conversation. Victoria van der Hoven did not scream or throw tantrums. She was a woman who waged war with surgical precision. She observed Clara with the detached focus of a viper waiting to strike. She noted how the girls clung to Clara's apron strings, how Julian's eyes followed the maid across the room, and most dangerously, how the failure to thrive diagnosis was slowly evaporating. The quintuplets were gaining color. Their laughter echoed in the hallways. If they recovered, Julian would never need a wife to manage his burden. He would just need Clara. The strike came on a Thursday evening, the night of the Foundation Gala. Julian was required to attend, leaving the household in a state of high activity. "I'll stay behind, Julian," Victoria said smoothly, adjusting his bow tie in the foyer. "I have a migraine coming on. Besides, someone should keep an eye on things here. You know, just in case." Julian hesitated, looking up the stairs toward the nursery. "Clara is with them." "Of course," Victoria smiled, a thin, brittle expression. "But supervision is always wise. Go. Save the world." The trap was set. Around 8 p.m., Clara was in the kitchen preparing the girls' evening tonic, a blend of chamomile, honey, and elderberry she made from scratch to boost their immune systems. She hummed a low melody, the steam rising around her face. She stepped into the pantry to grab a fresh jar of honey. In that 10-second window, Victoria ghosted into the kitchen. She moved silently in her satin slippers. From the pocket of her cashmere robe, she produced a small vial of concentrated almond extract. Harmless to most, but Victoria had read the girls' medical charts. Rose and Daisy had severe nut sensitivities. Not fatal, but terrifyingly dramatic. She tipped the liquid into the simmering pot, stirred it once with a silver spoon, and vanished before the pantry door swung back open. Clara returned, oblivious. She poured the tea into 5 little mugs painted with clouds. An hour later, the chaos began. Julian's phone buzzed in the middle of a toast. It was a frantic call from the house security. He didn't wait for the valet. He ran to his car. When he burst through the front doors of the mansion, the scene was a nightmare resurrected. Paramedics were already in the nursery. The air smelled of panic and epinephrine. Rose and Daisy were gasping, their faces swollen and covered in angry red hives. They were crying, a rasping, terrifying sound. The other 3 girls were huddled in the corner, screaming. "What happened?" Julian roared, tearing off his jacket. "They were fine this morning." Victoria stood by the window, looking pale and shaken, holding a small, unlabeled glass bottle she had found in Clara's cleaning cart. "I told you, Julian," Victoria sobbed, playing the part of the terrified stepmother-to-be perfectly. "I told you she was reckless. I found this in her bag. Some sort of witch doctor concussion. She's been dosing them, Julian, experimenting on them with unapproved herbs." Julian snatched the bottle. It was just essential oil of lavender that Clara used for their pillows, but in his state of blind panic, it looked like poison. He turned to Clara. She was on her knees by Rose's bed, holding an oxygen mask to the child's face, tears streaming down her own cheeks. "Get away from her," Julian screamed. The sound tore his throat. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Thorne, I don't know what happened. I only gave them the tea." "The tea?" Julian pointed at the mugs. "You poisoned them. I trusted you." The trauma of losing his wife, the years of watching his daughters fade, it all crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Reason was drowned by fear. He didn't see the woman who had brought laughter back to his home. He saw a threat. "Julian, please, look at me," Clara pleaded, standing up, her hands trembling. "I love them. I would never—" "Security!" Julian barked. "Get her out, now!" Two large guards stepped forward, grabbing Clara by the arms. "No!" Violet screamed from the corner, scrambling across the floor. "No, Clara! Don't take Clara!" "Daddy, stop!" Iris wailed. But Julian was deaf to them. He was locked in the icy grip of protection. "Get her off the property. If she comes near this house again, I'll have her arrested." Clara didn't fight the guards. She looked at Julian, her gaze piercing through his panic. "You are making a mistake, Julian. Look at the tea. Test the tea. Don't let your fear win." "Out!" he bellowed. Victoria stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Julian's heaving shoulder. "Shh, darling, it's over. She's gone. I'm here now." Clara was dragged from the room. The last thing she heard before the heavy oak doors slammed shut was the heart-wrenching sound of 5 little girls screaming her name, a sound that would haunt Julian Thorne for the rest of his life. The crisis and the truth. The silence that followed Clara's departure was not the peaceful silence of sleep. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. 48 hours had passed since the incident. The allergic reactions had subsided quickly with antihistamines, proving they were mild, but the damage to the girls' spirits was catastrophic. The regression was absolute. The nursery, which had been filled with jazz music and storytelling just days ago, was dark. The curtains were drawn. The quintuplets lay in their beds, facing the walls. They refused to eat. They refused to speak. When the nurses came in with the sterile hospital trays, Iris threw her bowl across the room. "I want Clara," she whispered, her voice raspy. Julian stood in the hallway, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 days. He hadn't slept. He hadn't shaved. He felt a phantom limb pain, a hole in the house where Clara's warmth used to be. "They have to eat," Julian said to Dr. Roberts, his voice hollow. "They are depressed, Julian," the doctor said, closing his chart with a sigh. "Clinical depression in 5-year-olds. It's rare but severe. They've lost their attachment figure. Their cortisol levels are spiking. Their immune systems are crashing again because of the stress." "She poisoned them," Julian muttered, trying to convince himself. "She was dangerous." "Was she?" Dr. Roberts asked quietly. "I analyzed the blood work, Julian. It was almond extract, common baking extract. Why would a woman who spent weeks carefully rebuilding their nutrition suddenly feed them something she knew they were sensitive to?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Julian walked away. He couldn't handle the logic. He needed to be angry because if he wasn't angry, he was just broken. He wandered into the kitchen. It was spotless, cold, and efficient. Victoria had hired a new staff immediately, men in white coats who didn't sing. Julian sat at the counter staring at the stove. "Test the tea," Clara had said. Something nagged at him. A splinter in his mind. He remembered the foundation gala. He remembered Victoria claiming she had a migraine. He stood up and walked to the security control room in the basement. He hadn't checked the cameras since Clara left. He was afraid to see the empty nursery. He sat in the ergonomic chair and pulled up the archives. Tuesday, 7:45 p.m. He watched Clara chopping fruit. She looked happy. She was dancing slightly to no music. She went into the pantry. Julian leaned in. On the screen, a figure entered the frame. It wasn't a ghost. It was Victoria. She wasn't holding her head in pain. She was moving quickly. He watched, horrified, as she pulled the vial from her robe, dumped it into the pot, and stirred it. The look on her face wasn't pain. It was a smirk. Julian stopped the video. He replayed it. Frame by frame. The woman he was engaged to. The woman who claimed to love him. She had knowingly poisoned his children to win an argument. A guttural sound escaped Julian's lips, a mix of a sob and a growl. He felt sick. He had cast out the only person who had ever truly healed them, and he had protected the monster. He stood up, knocking the chair over, but then he saw something else on the desk. The security chief had left a box of confiscated items from Clara's room. Julian opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a worn, leather-bound notebook. It was cheap, the kind you buy at a drugstore, but it was thick with papers sticking out. He opened the first page. Project Sunshine, a guide to the Thorn Girls. It wasn't a medical log, it was a love letter. Lily, afraid of the dark, but loves stories about the moon, needs her left hand held to fall asleep. Rose, hates the texture of mashed potatoes, loves crunchy things, needs to be told she is brave at least 3 times a day. Daisy, the artist, needs crayons, not pills. When she is quiet, she isn't sad, she is thinking. Violet and Iris, they are a single soul in 2 bodies. Never separate them during treatment. Julian flipped through the pages. There were drawings, pressed flowers from the garden, recipes for magic immune-boosting smoothies, with notes like, "Add extra honey for Iris." There was an entry dated the day of the firing. Note to self, "Mr. Thorn looks so tired. He carries the world. Remind him that he is a good father. He just forgot how to play. I think he's starting to trust me. I think we are going to be okay." Julian fell to his knees. The notebook clutched to his chest. He wept. He wept for his wife, for his daughters, for his own stupidity, and for Clara. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He loved her. Not just as a nanny, not just as an employee. He loved the way she loved them. He loved the light she brought into his dark world. The door to the security room opened. Victoria stood there, looking impeccable in a white dress. "Julian, dinner is served. I had the chef prepare." She stopped. She saw the frozen image on the screen behind him, her hand hovering over the pot. She saw the notebook in his hand. She saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a broken man anymore. It was the look of a king who had discovered treason. "Get out," Julian said. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. "Julian, let me explain. It was just a little... Get out." He stood up, towering over her. "You have 10 minutes to leave my house before I call the police and show them this video. If you ever come near my children again, I will destroy you." Victoria turned and ran. Julian didn't watch her go. He grabbed his keys. He didn't call the driver. He didn't call security. He ran to the garage, jumped into the fastest car he owned, and roared out of the driveway. He didn't know the address, but he knew where to start. He drove toward the neon lights of the city, toward the checkered floors and the smell of grease. He drove toward Ruby's diner. He drove toward the only hope his family had left. The redemption and new beginning. The rain had started to fall, a torrential downpour that turned the city streets into slick, reflecting mirrors of neon and regret. Julian Thorn drove his Aston Martin not with the arrogance of a billionaire, but with the desperation of a fugitive. The GPS guided him away from the hills of silence and into the avenues, a neighborhood of cramped row houses, chain-link fences, and life lived loudly on the front porch. He parked the car haphazardly in front of Ruby's diner. The vehicle looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in the wrong century. Julian stepped out, ignoring the rain that instantly soaked his bespoke Italian suit. He didn't run, he marched. He clutched the cheap water-stained notebook against his chest as if it were the Holy Grail. He pushed open the door. The bell jingled, the same sound that had heralded his rage weeks ago. Now, it announced his penance. The diner was near closing. Earl, the burly owner with forearms like tree trunks, looked up from the grill. He recognized Julian instantly. He reached under the counter, his expression darkening. "We're closed to you," Earl rumbled. Julian didn't stop. He scanned the room, and then he saw her. Clara was in the back booth, the very same one where the girls had eaten their sundaes. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans. She looked smaller, her radiant light dimmed by the shadow of humiliation. She was staring into a cup of cold coffee, looking utterly defeated. "Clara," Julian said. His voice was a wreck. She looked up. Her eyes widened, first in shock, then in a flash of hurt. She stood up, grabbing her purse. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Thorne. I haven't contacted the press. I haven't sued. Just leave me alone." "I don't care about the press," Julian said, stepping past Earl, who had come around the counter with a spatula held like a weapon. "Earl, it's okay," Clara said softly, raising a hand. Julian stopped 3 feet from her. He felt unworthy to be in her orbit. He held out the notebook. His hand was shaking. "I found it," he whispered. "I read it. All of it." Clara stared at the battered book. Her breath hitched. "That's private. It's a manual on how to love my children," Julian said, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I thought I was protecting them. I thought sterile meant safe. I thought silence meant peace. But I was just keeping them in a waiting room for death." He dropped to his knees, right there on the checkered floor. The fabric of his suit soaked up the grease and the dust of the day. "Mr. Thorne, get up!" Clara hissed, looking around the empty diner. "You're making a scene." "I don't care," Julian choked out. "I drove Victoria away. She's gone. But the house is dying, Clara. The girls, they've stopped speaking. Iris won't let go of the spoon you gave her. They are fading. And all my money, all my doctors, all my power. It's useless. I am a beggar, Clara. I am begging you." He looked up at her, his grey eyes stripped of all pretense. "I can't pay you enough to fix what I broke. But please, save them. Be their mother, not their nurse. Their mother. Because you already are." Clara looked down at the man who had humiliated her, the man who represented everything that was broken in the world. But she didn't see a billionaire. She saw a father who had finally woken up. She reached out and took the notebook from his hand. She opened it to a marked page, her finger tracing a drawing Daisy had made of a sun with a face. "Get up, Julian," she said, using his first name for the first time. It sounded like forgiveness. He stood, swaying slightly. "My car is out back," she said, her voice strengthening, the steel returning to her spine. "We'll take mine. Your car doesn't have car seats." The return to the Thorne mansion was not a quiet affair. Clara burst through the front doors like a storm front, with Julian trailing behind her carrying her bags. She didn't stop to greet the staff. She didn't check in with security. She marched straight up the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing with purpose. She threw open the double doors of the nursery. The room was dim, lit only by the blinking lights of the medical monitors. The air was stale. The 5 beds were occupied by 5 silent, huddled lumps. Clara didn't whisper. She didn't tiptoe. She walked to the window and ripped the heavy velvet curtains open. Moonlight flooded the room. "All right, my little warriors," Clara announced, her voice booming with joy. "Wake up. The dark days are over." Daisy was the first to move. She lifted her head, her eyes squinting against the light. She saw the silhouette. "Clara?" she whispered. Terrified it was a dream. Clara flicked the light switch. "Who else would it be?" "I heard someone was refusing to eat their vegetables. And you know what happens when we skip vegetables? We don't get dessert." "Clara!" It was a chain reaction. Daisy scrambled out of bed, then Rose, then Violet. The room erupted into chaos. The IV poles were knocked over. They weren't attached. The monitors beeped wildly as heart rates spiked, not from distress, but from pure adrenaline. They hit her like a wave. 5 little bodies slamming into her legs, burying their faces in her jeans, sobbing, screaming, laughing. Clara dropped to the floor, gathering them all into her arms. She kissed bald heads, wet cheeks, and tiny hands. "I'm here. I'm here. I'm never leaving again. I promise. Cross my heart and hope to die." Julian stood in the doorway, watching. He saw the color returning to their faces in real time. He saw the lifeless dolls transform back into children. He leaned his head against the doorframe and wept silently, washing away 5 years of grief. Iris, the smallest, looked up from the cuddle pile. She saw Julian. "Daddy brought you back?" she asked. Clara looked up at Julian, her eyes shining. "Yes, sweetie. Daddy went on a big quest to find me. He fought a dragon and everything." Julian managed a watery smile. "The dragon was very scary," he said, his voice thick, "but Clara is braver." 6 months later, the Thorne estate was unrecognizable. The marble floors were covered in colorful rugs. The silence had been replaced by the constant, chaotic hum of life. There were muddy footprints in the foyer. There was the smell of baking bread wafting from the kitchen. In the garden, under the shade of a massive oak tree, a picnic was in progress. The Quintuplets were unrecognizable. Their hair had grown back, a riot of curls in different shades of brown and gold. They were round-cheeked, sun-kissed, and loud. They were running through the sprinklers, shrieking with delight. Julian sat on a plaid blanket watching them. He looked younger. The lines of worry on his forehead had smoothed out. He was wearing a t-shirt, an actual cotton t-shirt, and shorts. Clara sat beside him, pouring lemonade. She wore a yellow sundress that made her look like the personification of summer. "Daisy's teacher called," Clara said casually. "Apparently she started a trade ring in kindergarten. She's swapping your organic fruit snacks for Oreos." Julian laughed, a deep belly sound that felt good in his chest. "That's my girl, an entrepreneur." He turned to look at Clara. The sun filtered through the leaves, dappling her face. He felt that familiar pull, the gravity that had centered his entire universe around her. "Clara," he said. She turned, smiling. "Yes? I have a business proposition," he said, reaching into his pocket. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Are you finally going to give me a raise?" "Better," Julian said. He pulled out a small velvet box. "I want to restructure the management of this family. I'm finding the role of single boss to be inefficient. I need a co-founder, a partner with equal equity." Clara went still. She put down the lemonade pitcher. Julian opened the box. It wasn't a diamond the size of a skating rink. It was a vintage ring, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds, green for growth, for life. "I love you," Julian said simply. "Not because you saved them, but because you saved me. You taught me that a house isn't a home without noise, and a heart isn't beating if it isn't breaking open for someone else. Marry me, Clara. Be my wife. Be their mother. Officially." Clara looked at the ring, then at the girls running in the distance, then back at Julian. Tears pooled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She beamed. "You know," she whispered, leaning in close, "I come with a lot of baggage. 5 very loud, very messy critics." "I'm counting on it," Julian smiled. "Then yes," Clara said. "Yes, Mr. Thorne, I'll take the job." Julian slipped the ring on her finger. He kissed her, deep and slow, sealing the pact under the oak tree. "Ew!" They broke apart. The 5 girls were standing in a semicircle, dripping wet from the sprinklers, making gagging noises. "Daddy is kissing Clara!" Rose shrieked. "Gross!" Violet yelled. "Do it again!" Iris cheered. Julian laughed, grabbing Clara's hand and pulling her up. "Get them!" The chase was on. The billionaire and the former maid ran across the great lawn, chasing the 5 miracles who had cheated death, their laughter rising up into the blue sky, loud enough to scare away the silence forever. Epilogue. 5 years later. The scene opens on the interior of Ruby's diner. It is bustling, packed with customers. But the best table, the round one with the yellow edge, is reserved. 10-year-old Lily, Rose, Daisy, Violet, and Iris are crammed into the booth. They are beautiful, healthy preteens, arguing over which song to play on the jukebox. They wear school uniforms, their hair in intricate braids, clearly Clara's handiwork. The bell rings. Julian walks in, his hair slightly graying at the temples, holding the hand of a toddler, a little boy with Clara's eyes and Julian's chin. Clara follows them, looking radiant, carrying a diaper bag and a briefcase. She has just finished her shift at the pediatric wing of the city hospital, the new wing funded by the Thorne Foundation, which she now runs. "Mom! Dad!" Daisy yells, "Rose is hogging the fries!" "I am not," Rose argues. "I'm redistributing resources." Julian slides into the booth, lifting the toddler onto his lap. He looks at the chaos around him. The noise is deafening. The table is sticky. It is the furthest thing from the sterile, cold life he once valued. Clara slides in next to him. She leans her head on his shoulder, exhausted but content. "Happy anniversary," she whispers. Julian looks at the neon sign reflecting in the window. He looks at his 5 daughters, vibrant and alive. He looks at his son. He looks at his wife. "Project Sunshine," he murmurs, kissing the top of her head. "What?" Clara asks. "Nothing," Julian smiles, stealing a fry from Rose's plate. "Just success. Total success." The camera pulls back, out of the diner window, rising above the rain-slicked streets, above the city, showing a world that is messy, loud, and imperfect, but undeniably, beautifully alive. End of story.